The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Hi everybody, my name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research here at the University of Canberra. I want to start by acknowledging that we are on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people here today. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rachel M. Campbell, who is a Senior Lecturer in Arts here at the University of Canberra. Rachel's research sits at the intersection of historical celebrity studies and visual culture, with a focus on the visual representation of musicians and composers in the long 19th century. Her doctoral work developed a multidisciplinary methodology to examine how the proliferation of print technologies transformed musical celebrity, exploring figures including Dame Nellie Melba and Jenny Lind. Rachel argues that the relationship between celebrity, image, and fame is a far from modern phenomenon. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much, Paul, and it's really lovely to be here, colleagues. Usually I'm faced with the Gen Z stare of my first year students, and so it's lovely to be in your company today, even though I do love them a lot. I want to acknowledge and echo Paul's acknowledgement of country as well, and pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging and First Nations people here today. So this paper is titled Image Making and Celebrity Culture, or How Kim Kardashian Broke the Internet with Her Butt, which actually I did not come up with that. That is a headline from The Guardian. And it's really a point of departure. It's a sort of unashamedly clickbaity start for us today. So this was the cover of Paper Magazine in 2014, a photograph by Jean-Paul Goude, and it promised to break the internet. This seminar is centered around celebrity and image making, but I think it's useful for us to think about an oft-quoted definition of celebrity, which is a person who is well known for his well-knownness, from Daniel Borstein in 1961. And almost immediately in the Paper Magazine article, we can see a reference. The author says, if you know nothing else about Kim Kardashian, you know that she is very, very famous. Some would say that's all you need to know. And this is a point of departure for us to consider how image making and celebrity may be connected. I want to acknowledge that this image is a reimagination of an image from 1976 of Carolina Beaumont. And again, in some commentary from media at the time of the Kardashian article, they say people are looking at it like it's an edgy cover, but it's really a recycled image that perpetuates the fetishization of women's bodies, particularly women of color. Kim Kardashian is a white Armenian-American woman who's been fetishized for attributes that have been stereotyped as black. And the book by Jean-Paul Goude, Jungle Fever, has been sort of identified as highly problematic in that sort of generation of images. But what I want to use this as a point of departure about is that celebrity images are never neutral. They carry ideological freight. which is a way of thinking about images, about the assumptions that we make when we see them, about power structures, about social values that an image carry, often invisibly. But particularly linked to where and when and by whom they were made. And this is an idea after Hall, Barth, and Althusser. But the central contention of my work is that celebrity-based image is not new. It's very easy for us to latch onto Kim Kardashian and her bottom, which is, when I started my PhD, not something I thought I was going to be Googling, naked images of Kim Kardashian, but research takes us into interesting places in the internet. I started off with a definition from Borstein about celebrity, and I wanted to take that a little bit further to situate us a little bit more clearly about what we might be talking about. So Chris Rojek talks about 3 types of celebrity. He talks about ascribed, achieved, or attributed celebrity. And the one that's most of interest for us today is attributed celebrity. And Rojek tells us that attributed celebrities are identified through the concentrated representation of an individual as noteworthy or exceptional by cultural intermediaries. And it's quite easy to see with Kim Kardashian that that's certainly true. You may or may not remember, but Kim Kardashian rose to prominence as the stylist of Paris Hilton, another sort of quasi-celebrity, of course followed up pretty swiftly after that by her sex tape, which is often thought that her mum released into the internet to gain her that notoriety. So we're thinking about celebrity in this way of attribution by cultural intermediaries, which is the most critical part of that definition. But I'd like to argue that celebrity is not a modern construct. And Rojek tells us about this. He says, achieved celebrity predated the rise of the mass media. Bigots, forgers, criminals, whites, balladeers, and thinkers have been objects of attention since Greek and Roman times. They possessed what one might call prefigurative celebrity status. That is, they were items of public discourse, and honorific or notorious status was certainly attributed to them. But they did not carry the illusion of intimacy, the sense of being an exalted confrere that is part of celebrity status in the age of mass media. And I'm not going to talk a lot about parasocial interactions today, but it is a key part of the work. But I think what's interesting is that Rojek specifically mentions achieved celebrities, so celebrities who might have actually done something clever, perhaps a painter, a singer, a composer. But I think that this system in the 19th century also does reveal attributed celebrities who were just known for their knownness. And hopefully your brain is kind of pinging with some people that you might be able to think of that fits into that category. Antoine Lilty, who wrote this book, The Invention of Celebrity, which again is a really key kind of part about celebrity being invented, he says celebrity is not a recent phenomenon, a vulgar derivative of postmodernism, as the most common response has it. It's been developing since the 18th century, and its first golden age was in the 19th. And that's certainly what I found through my research. It's a particular form of notoriety, and its development is linked to the economic and cultural changes which have affected European society since the 18th century. And he talks about these 3 elements that converged in the 19th century that gave us the perfect foundation for this type of celebrity. He talks about technological, cultural, and economic. And that's certainly, again, what I found in my research of looking at a mass range of images. And I looked at the same image over time and the same image over space. I found them in all sorts of corners of the world to see how far they traveled and in what modes. So the contention that I'd like to draw attention to today is before the internet, before television, before photography, celebrity was already being made, sustained, and sold through images. And the definition of celebrity that I came up with in my research was that we needed fame, we needed that notoriety, but we also needed an element of commodity to give us that celebrity. And it's quite a good sort of handle to rest that on, I think. Because there was a recognizable cult of celebrity in the 1900s. Before we had Beatles mania, we had Byron mania and also Linda mania, and I'm going to talk about that. Byron, of course, the handsome playboy. Women sent him very saucy letters. They didn't quite throw their bras at him like they did with the Beatles, but we came pretty close. So when did this system begin and how can we sort of see it? So what we're looking for here is a recognizable system of image-based celebrity. And a fun sort of point of departure that I'd like to start with today is Madame Tussauds, before I get to Melba and Lind. So Madame Tussauds, born Marie Grolsch, was an apprentice to a great waxworks pioneer, Philip Curtius. He left his collection to her, and it's thought that her first effigy that she made was reported to be that of Voltaire, which she completed in 1777. So perhaps much earlier than you might have thought with Madame Tussauds as the Waxworks Museum. It toured around for quite a long time, and then its first permanent exhibition was in 1835 in Baker Street, and as you would know, there's Madame Tussauds all over the place now, not anymore owned by the Tussauds family. And we can see there on the right her death mask. The genesis of image-based celebrity and the connection with Madame Tussauds, I think, is interesting because it's centered around notoriety. We had a fascination with victims of the French Revolution. They would go to the guillotines and the prisons, and people who had been put to death, they would take the bodies or take death masks, and then they would make these wax effigies. And I think it was in the year 2000, I went to Madame Tussauds in London. The House of Horrors was, you could go down some stairs, and that's very much akin to that early genesis of this image-based kind of notoriety. We can see there a wax effigy of Hitler, which had been defaced and was being removed, and on the right, Stalin. And it fits in with that Victorian and earlier fascination with the macabre. And that's, I think, an interesting way for us to think about where this image-based celebrity might have started, even though I'm just dipping out of the long 19th century ever so slightly to make that point. Hilaire Belloc, in his foreword of John Tussauds' book about his mother, said, "Whatever you may read of some man prominent in the past, whatever picture or sculpture you may find of him, will never be so full and exact as in the case of an effigy made by a contemporary who saw him, watched him, knew him, and whose whole motive was exactitude in reproduction." Which I think, again, is quite interesting. I really can't go past this moment without mentioning an effigy we saw on the concourse on Tuesday of our Vice-Chancellor, because I was preparing for this talk and there was a moment of connection in my brain. And I promised myself I wasn't going to tell any jokes, but anyway, I am still me. So the waxwork intersection, I think, is quite fascinating. And I did look at modern waxworks as part of my research. Uta Kornmeier says, "A closer look at the history of the waxworks reveals the subtlety and extent to which they have adapted to the cultural, economic, ideological, and social context they were operating in." And that's really key for us, is what was happening at the time and why were these things so interesting and so key to our understanding. And I'd like to suggest that here just the images do the work. The image comes before often the knowledge of the person. Simon Morgan asked this question, is celebrity academic pseudo-event or a useful concept for historians? And he says, if we wish to distinguish celebrity as a status that is distinct from other types of fame without making value judgments about its relative social worth, it's necessary to shift our focus away from the individual celebrity and their particular claim to fame to consider the mechanism by which that fame is generated and spread. And certainly the conclusion that I came to after looking at many images over time is that image really does a lot of the work for us. And I'd like to consider the case study of Dame Nellie Melba here. So Melba, as hopefully you know, is a famous Australian soprano. Before they said more farewells than John Farnham, they said more farewells than Dame Nellie Melba. She had a torrid marriage to Charles Armstrong and was a victim of intimate partner violence, we would call it now. And she was, I think, a very stubborn woman. She was an autonomous celebrity. She never had a manager. She might engage someone for a time, but she really wanted to control her own things. She wanted to control her assets, her money, where she appeared. And there's a fabulous anecdote that's in one of her biographies that says, after a dinner, someone said, "Would you sing a little song?" And she said, "Only if you write a little check." So she was a very particular individual, I think. Died in 1932 from septicemia. The urban legend there is that it was from a facelift. I have not been able to corroborate that in my research, but I've had some pretty great arguments with people who are really interested in that. The only reason I think it might be possible is that I think she probably was quite vain, and we're going to see why in a second. So here are some images of Melba. We've got the $100 note. And images of her in costume. And this was really important because at the time, it was still seen as vulgar to be a celebrity. To be a woman on the stage was essentially akin to being a prostitute. And both Lilty and Faye Dudden talk about this. Lilty says, a celebrated man seduced his female public. And we saw that with Byron, right? And then had to protect himself from the excessive reactions. A celebrated woman was disgraced and illegitimate. And Dudden says the actress has been equated with whore so persistently that no amount of clean living and rectitude among the actual performers has ever served to cancel the equation. So one way we get around this in iconography is for these celebrated women to be pictured in costume. And here we've got her in The Barber of Seville. We've got her as Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. And this was a way that we could kind of get around that. But as I said, Melba, a very particular individual. I felt through my research and through reading a lot of her letters at the National Library and seeing a lot of portraiture, was desperate for the perfect portrait. She was really seeking it. On the left, we have Charles Bunny's Madame Melba, which is hanging actually of like a week ago, not hanging in Government House in Victoria, but I believe it's going to be restored there. She hated this portrait, and as we'll see from some photographs of her, it doesn't look like her at all, but it is in this swagger portrait style, which is akin to the way we see kings. It's larger than life, this portrait. It's about 8 or 10 feet tall. She's standing in her land, which was sort of imbued with this symbology of being a person of stature and wealth. But I 100% agree, it doesn't look like her at all. On the right, we've got a bust by Bertram McKennell, and this is a great story. She had this bust made. She didn't tell the National Gallery of Victoria that she was doing it, and then she gave it to them. A bit like, someone bringing you a lasagna when you don't really want it, I guess. And she said this, which I love. She says, from a daughter of the city, as a tribute to her unfailing remembrance and affection, may I express the hope that I am not wholly forgotten in our beloved country, and the very cordial greetings which I venture to send through you to my brother and sister Australians will not be without a kindly response. Have this bust that I made for you. It is unfortunately not on display anymore, but I have seen it on display at the NGV. She is depicted in a really beautiful classical way. We can see what I termed as like a pre-mythologization. She wanted a legacy. She wanted this image-based legacy, and which is why she was in search of what I thought that was the perfect portrait. I don't believe she ever found it, and I resisted the temptation to bombard you with all the portraits, but I have seen a portrait sketch by Hugh Ramsay. There's a little portrait sketch of her in the National Portrait Gallery, which is of her in a hat, but Hugh Ramsay said he was too nervous to do a proper thing because she was in his presence and he loved her, and he ended up calling her Aunt Melba in letters. But he went on to do another portrait sketch, which I've seen. It's held privately, but I have seen an image of it, which seems to have disappeared from the internet, so I couldn't show you, but it's absolutely beautiful, and I think that would be the perfect portrait. She's resplendent in a gown, there's this red chintz behind her, and it's got the air, I think, of opera singer, but also great Australian. She raised a lot of money for the World War I effort through her book, the Melba's Gift book. And when she, talks about not being wholly forgotten by her brother and sister Australians, being Australian meant a lot to her. She always finished her concerts. She'd sit at the piano and sing Home Sweet Home. And her performing name of Melba, of course, from her hometown. So Melba is an interesting case study when we think about this image-based celebrity, because she was a celebrity in that sense of being commodified. People, before she made her very famous first recordings around 1900, people would know of her before they'd heard her sing. The image would come first. And we see this in a lot of photographs, for instance, by Spencer Shear and Harold Casno, which went before her. She'd sign heaps of them and send them out. And I found them seriously all over the world in the strangest places, these photographs of Melba. But as I said, she was an autonomous celebrity. She controlled everything, right up to her famous string of farewell concerts. And her funeral was something to behold. People lined the streets. Her carriage went through from Richmond to Coombe, her cottage in the Yarra Valley, and it sort of reminded me 100 years later of, like Princess Diana's funeral. Like that's the kind of outpouring of grief that we saw. And not every one of those people could have heard her at that time. And actually, one of my methodological decisions when I did this research was I was not going to listen to recordings of her. I'm a musician, I'm a classical singer myself, but I just didn't. I decided not to have that part of it. And I did really, really well until I went to Coombe Cottage and I was in the bathroom and they had it piped into the bathroom. You could have your scones with Melba jam and cream and whatever, and she was playing in the bathrooms. And I don't think she would have been amused about that at all. Now, in contrast, I'd like to talk a little bit about Jenny Lind. The Swedish soprano came before Melba, and her celebrity functioned in a really different way, although her image was still central. She was born in 1920. And what's really interesting about Lind is her connection to P.T. Barnum, who, we all know from The Greatest Showman and other things. And people went mad for Lind. P.T. Barnum was very clever in commodifying her as a celebrity. He brought her to the United States in 1850, and he had never seen her before or heard her. And when she arrived in New York, there was 30,000 admirers at the dock to see her get off the ship. Like quite unbelievable. And interestingly, Lind was very religious, and she gave up singing opera at a very young age because she felt, I guess, with the discourse of the time that it was vulgar and it sort of wasn't in line with her values about purity and things like that. And we see that really strongly in her iconography. So on the far right there, you've got Magnus's painting of her, which is in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And lots of versions of that have persevered over time. Sometimes it's reversed, lithographs and things like that. But she's pictured in white. And P.T. Barnum had a big hand in this of setting her up as this virginal, pure, pious woman. And so she would sing in concert, but she didn't sing opera. We can see that a little bit on the left-hand side images where she's in a blue gown with a white lace trim. The bottom one is a painting, and then the top is in, artists' appreciation version of it. And in the center, a photograph, also held in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And again, she's in white. She's pictured in a very certain way. And what I found fascinating when I watched The Greatest Showman when it came out, even though I didn't really like it as a movie, is she is still pictured in white. Jenny Lind appears in that movie and she's still pictured in white. So it's been a very enduring way of depicting Lind. Her decision to abandon opera on moral grounds actually doesn't go hand in hand with this commoditized celebrity. But Barnum was a step ahead. He decided to depict her as this virginal, godly, unthreatening kind of pious woman. So then this is what we see in the canon. But the image was what made her consumable, and the way she became depicted over time made it tolerable to the society. And this idea of commoditization in Jenny Lind is perfect. We see an amazing array of products to do with Jenny Lind. You can still get a Jenny Lind doll and a Jenny Lind crib today. But there's a fantastic entry in the Belfast Mercury from the 23rd of September, 1851. The writer says, "We had yesterday the pleasure of being shaved with a Jenny Lind razor, by a Jenny Lind barber, scented with Jenny Lind cologne, combed with a Jenny Lind comb, brushed with a Jenny Lind brush, washed in a Jenny Lind bowl, wiped with a Jenny Lind towel, after which we put on a Jenny Lind hat, walked into a Jenny Lind restaurant and partook of Jenny Lind sausage. Then we took up a Jenny Lind paper, read a Jenny Lind editorial, smoked a Jenny Lind cigar, and throwing ourselves in a Jenny Lind chair, fell into a Jenny Lind reverie." And I think this is amazing because it really shows, obviously a satire, but it really shows how products became associated with Jenny Lind. And as I said, you can still get them today. And again, this was all controlled by P.T. Barnum. So where Melba wasn't what I'd called an autonomous celebrity, Lind was very much a managed celebrity. She went along with it. She earned a lot of money, but she did go along with it and participate in that sort of system of commoditized fame or celebrity. So back to Kim, because I thought I better bring it home in a sensible way. We can see some interesting parallels here with this paper magazine imagery of Kim Kardashian and her professing to break the internet. So we can see that this Good Kardashian image isn't just a glamorous magazine carrier. It's actually carrying a lot of things, and I talked about it before as ideological freight. So it's carrying a history of the sexualization and objectification of Black women's bodies, a set of assumptions about whose body is spectacular and whose is exotic. We can also see the economics of a media industry that profits from provocation. And an interesting thing about the paper magazine cover is that if we look at other paper magazine covers around the same time, the Kardashian image stands out. It's visually very different. Most of the other covers are of portrait kind of bust, lots more close up of the face. Nobody else was naked. But if we and we can sort of zoom out and see that the Kardashian image really does stand out in a very, very strange way. But most importantly, the Kardashian image has at its base a racist 1976 original that none of the viral audience ever saw or knew about. And we can see a similar parallel, I think, with the iconography of Melba and Lind, and to a lesser extent with the Two Swords wax effigies. They've got the ideological freight of their moment. And in this 19th century situation, we can see assumptions about femininity, about nationhood, and about respectability. We can see a set of rules that are largely unspoken, and it comes into Habermas's idea of the public and private sphere as well, about what a celebrated woman was permitted to look like. So in the case of Melba, in her early days, we see her in costume. With Lind, we see her reimagined as this godly, pious woman. We can see an economics of a print and leisure industry that profited from mass reproduction, and that's really central here, as we heard from Lilty, as one of those elements that helped this really explode. But also an audience that felt they knew them intimately without ever hearing them sing. So I'll leave us with this question. I think it's interesting to think, does the celebrity create the image, or perhaps does the image create the celebrity? And I welcome questions. Thank you so much.
Anyone like to start off with a comment or a question?
I was just wondering, during your research, did a lady called Sarah Bartman come up at all? Sarah Bartman, Bartman, I think.
Is she an actress?
No, so she was a sort of minor celebrity in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Famously enslaved African that was sold to the British as the Hottentot Venus,
Yes.
is what she was referred
Yes.
to. And at least aesthetically, a lot of the sort of emphasis on sort of certain aspects of Black femininity, I think, definitely don't start there, but at least from a celebrity point of view, there's a sort of interesting starting point.
I do know who you're talking about, and this is one of those sort of Barnum-esque sort of fancies, and she's famous for having a very large bottom that she could rest things on. And so that image, and there's some physiognomic imagery through that I chose not to show because there's a really like a line where it becomes quite unsettling. But that is the precursor of the Caroline Beaumont image with the champagne on her bottom, and then Kim Kardashian then recreated that. So yes, sorry, I do know who you're talking about. And so some of those things, I mean, other colleagues of ours in FAD will be able to speak more easily about modern fetishization of women. But that's certainly, we can sort of see that precursor coming through of that particular set of imagery, certainly. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. That was really comprehensive and very, very interesting. Sorry, the question I have relates to this image creating, or the other way around. If you took someone, I'm trying to think of someone who's absolutely boring and not attractive, do you think the Barnum-esque quality can raise them to a celebrity? Or do they have to have something they're bringing to the party?
Thank you for that. I think this comes back to our definitions from Rojek about achieved, attributed celebrities. Certainly we see not very prominent people being like risen to very recognizable. And what I decided not to talk about today, but you've given me a perfect entryway, thank you for that, is cartoons and caricatures. We need the recognizable system of image-based celebrity, or these cartoons and caricatures don't work. And I've got a really wonderful book that I think my next paper will be about called The Alphabet of Celebrities, which is it's a little poem and celebrity images, and it's got Wagner and it's got Queen Victoria and other things in it. And that sort of celebrity doesn't work if we don't have something that's already existing. And so there's lots of caricatures of famous people and semi-famous people that do appear in things like that. I mean, Oscar Wilde comes to mind, but obviously he's very prominent. So I think that certainly we have an element of the notoriety of the person first. So I don't think in the 19th century, perhaps you or I would be risen to the ranks of celebrity. So yes, there has to be something there of an achieved status, which we see less now in modern celebrity. But I think certainly there are people that do appear in imagery in the 19th century that the names don't ring a bell. They're not household names, but they were to a minor extent at the time. So and caricatures and cartoons can sort of give a hint into how that might have worked.
Einstein is really interesting example. People, obviously, clearly, a physicist.
Yes.
It's obviously famous, but it's look.
Certainly. And again, we see this in the portraiture of Beethoven, which I've done a lot of work about the portraiture of Beethoven. And Beethoven, even if you ask little kids about this, they'll say, yeah, he was grumpy. He looked like he was always scowling. And we see that in the Stieler portrait of Beethoven, where he's got the Missa Solemnis. But that is actually the imagery from that. And we also see it in the Peanuts cartoon with the Beethoven that's on the piano. That is a bit of a furphy because those images are from the Life Mask of 1812. There's a copy of it in our National Library. And his conversation books at the time say that the first time that they tried to make this Life Mask of Beethoven, because they make you all covered in wax and they stick straws up your nose so you can breathe, he actually flung it off. He got claustrophobic and flung it off. So his heavy-set brow and his scowl is the distress that he was under, but it's perpetuated this really interesting imagery of Beethoven, which is iconic now, but it's not really based in a likeness. The portrait, which I think is the greatest likeness of Beethoven, was unfortunately incinerated by the Nazis, but we have some copies of it. But so that's really interesting. I think you're right, where there's a really easy likeness to latch onto. Einstein is one. Oscar Wilde also is one. In the long 19th century, we see Queen Victoria as another one. So certainly where there was physical features that really stood out and made it easy to latch onto, that sort of shorthand is more easily sort of understood by the audience. But it doesn't work unless the system already exists. Yeah.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks so much for that. I'm interested in this notion of celebrity and commodity. And no judgment, I saw Devil Wears Prada 2 this week. And in that movie, there's something like 40 cameos of celebrity. I'm not sure what my question is, but could you comment on, I mean, there's probably a reason why the filmmakers wanted to introduce that many celebrities, because it's like, go to see the movie and see if you can catch all 40. I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on what's in it for the celebrity.
Certainly. I think that there is a nice parallel here between modern celebrity and the economics of fame. We know that films don't get made unless they've got stars that are going to carry it. People won't fund them, right? And I think that the Devil Wears Prada is a good example of that, is it becomes like a sort of cultural flashpoint that people want to be involved in. And I think that does have parallels in the 19th century. We could see it sort of as a celebrity endorsement sort of thing. And in terms of like marketing and modern celebrity, that's not my area of expertise, but interestingly, Melba had her image on cigarette cards that you found in cigarette packets. And now, as a singer myself, I can't imagine having anything to do with smoking because there's values judgment there, right? But in the 19th century, they didn't have that. They just would, and getting the face out there was quite important. So in Melba, we see that a lot of image-based things. I haven't talked about carte de visite today, which I did want to talk about as well. But I think that there is a celebrity endorsement sort of like, it's the vulgarity of the economics of fame, I guess. I think that sort of carries that through. And there are some sort of parallels. I'm not exactly sure about modern because it's not really my area, but I think that it's probably also not new.
Thanks, Rachel. Actually, I wanted to ask about something you just mentioned, really, or at least the broader issue, carte de visite, and the technologies. I mean, visual technologies obviously shift enormously across the 19th century. And I wondered actually about the differences between Lind and Melba in that respect. I presume by the time Melba comes along, photography is much more easily conveyed via the press, via the printed press. By the time you get to around the late 19th century, early 20th century, than it had been earlier. And I'm just wondering what you'd see as the major kind of milestones in terms of those technological shifts in the 19th century.
Thanks so much for that, Frank. I think for me, it's that parasocial interaction that we see a real explosion of that in the 19th century. And this is not good historian of me, but I'm going to throw out a figure. But, at one point in London, there was like 1,000 daily papers or something like that. They had an enormous amount of papers. And this idea of, I think we heard it in the Rojek quote about being an exalted confrere, is that I don't believe that existed with Lind. But I think we do see it with Melba. People loved her. They latched onto her. She also got greeted by lots of people. The train would come in, with her on it at Lilydale, and there'd be people to greet her. So I think the difference there in that sort of 70, 80 years where they were both at their height of their fame is probably that parasocial interaction. And we see that in modern celebrity, right? You tweet something and someone likes it. I feel a bit like that when Frank likes my things on LinkedIn, we feel a parasocial interaction. And we have that. We have that in the 19th century. And another part of my work was to have a parallel between David Giles' parasocial interaction scale. He's a psychologist who works in the field, and he did one, and it was from like an email. His parasocial interactions range from an email to sex. And I tried to get a parallel to that, which isn't fully developed yet, of a 19th century parasocial interaction. And carte de visite does really feature. So that's where you could go and visit your friend and they're not there, so you leave your thing. And people collected those. There's an interesting collections aspect to this. So I think probably to answer your question, Frank, is that the difference is the parasocial interaction, which we don't have in those earlier versions of fame, just because the technology, as you say, wasn't there to carry that. And especially in the 19th century, we see an obsession with royals. There's a really fantastic painting called Rotten Row at Rotten Row, and it's looking at looking. People are kind of promenading around Rotten Row, and it's who you could see and what they were doing. And interestingly, again, I was watching Bridgerton, so I've got no judgment about you, Karen, but Bridgerton references Rotten Row, that they're going to go and see who was there. And there's another painting by William Frith called The Summer Exhibition, where we are looking at people taking in the summer exhibition, and they're famous people in the crowd that we can track and see, like Oscar Wilde is one of them again. And so I think there became much more fascination with that, and the royals kind of fit into that as well. So I think, some really interesting convergences in how they both sort of functioned.
That actually leads very well into my question, which was about royalty and celebrity. And my interest is in textiles, and particularly with the celebrity royals and what they wore and how it affected the commerce. So, for instance, we could say with Napoleon and Josephine, they're not really royalty at this stage, but Josephine chose to wear mauve, which had just been invented as an aniline dye, and it just took off the whole of the colour industry in Manchester, etc. So the economic ties to celebrity, but it was transmitted, I understand, largely through the class structure before it filtered down to the ordinary people. And then I thought, this was happening over in India in the previous ruling, and the way the Dutch East India Company brought it over. So this whole fascination of finding someone that became the celebrity for your product, but they had images. So if you go from India across to France, the drawings, the illustrations coming out were there everywhere. Sorry, I'm rambling on, but do you have any comments on this phenomenon of royalty and the marketing of it?
I think, in modern celebrity, what we see is I've got a product and I want it to spruik it somehow. So I go and approach a celebrity and I say, I've got this thing, will you put your name to it? But I think in the 19th century, it happened very differently. It happened more organically. I suspect Josephine didn't set out to make mauve the hit colour of 19 whatever, but it happened more organically. So in that sense, the trend came before the commoditization of it, which came before the transmission of it, and then the latching onto it. Because we do see with the print technologies being expanded so much, real interest in collecting images of even famous paintings that a middle class person would maybe not be able to see, let alone own, but they could have a print of it. And so I didn't include royals in my study because I'd have 10 PhDs and I'd never get it done. But I think that those mechanisms are very similar, and there's been some interesting writings about royalty in that way. And I think we see that in modern royalty too, right? What are they wearing? Can we wear that as well? So I think that probably the economics of it followed the celebrity rather than it being first. But I think it was still transmitted by images and disseminated through that imagery, so that if lots of people were looking at the thing, everyone wanted to wear mauve and you could afford to do so, then we do have a little bit of a status thing there probably too. Yeah, not exactly my area, but like super interesting, I think, about what the mechanisms of transmission were and how it affected that system.
Thanks very much, Rachel. You have the two attributes I most like in talks, which is they're really interesting and they're fun.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So thank you. It's following on from our friend here. The question comes up, the whole question of where politics fits into that. And I just might take a person who's not very well liked, but you look at Donald Trump and he had fame originally. He wanted to commodify it. He went into politics, and then that's followed through. And then you've got a whole imagery and a whole commodification from there. Excuse my ignorance, but how does that fit together in your overall view?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Of this really important topic.
Thank you. I feel like we're having a hive mind moment because the things that I didn't have time to say, you're asking me about. It's perfect. It's an academic stream. And so where I think this comes from is the Weberian notion of charisma, of a celebrated person with a flock who'll follow them. And so this is an old concept. Donald Trump has Weberian charisma for all of his faults. We also see Weberian charisma in Hitler, who can gather people together and make them follow them. And celebrity has an element of that. I think celebrity doesn't have an element of that. Fame has an element of that, where we've got people who are wanting to be latched onto. In terms of Melba, she wasn't political in the sense of being interested in politics, although she sang at the opening of our parliament 100 years next year. But she was right in with the royals. She got a lot of jewellery from the royal family. She had a torrid affair with the Duke d'Orléans, which was like scandalous because she was still married, of course. Her husband was in Queensland. And so there is an intersection there, but I think that we're still sort of unshackling at that time from the idea of patronage. And Melba certainly had the patronage of the English royal family. We can sort of see her fame in three spots: Australia, Britain, and the US. She was the first person to have her own dressing room at Covent Garden. And so I think that's probably where it intersects. But the charisma aspect is really, really interesting because we can see famous people who aren't charismatic, and the expert German Chancellor Angela Merkel comes to mind, very prominent woman, not super charismatic, right? Whereas Barack Obama has got this different sort of political way of operating, like that sort of rhetoric and things. So I think that the idea of charisma probably fits in there. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think it's one of the sort of elements and the precursors to that fame being commoditized and turning into celebrity, certainly.
Rachel, this is a question that maybe follows on from Mike's. It strikes me that with many politicians, the image of the voice, like image in that sense that we can have images of voices as well as, you know, appearances, the image of the voice is really prominent, and lots of people can, for instance, imitate their voice, even little kids, you know. And some of the sound bites really remain strong, like whether it's "you're fired" or, you know, whatever it is with Trump. Is that, like, you've talked about a range of situations where the celebrity ignores the voice, even though it's the most prominent professional
For singers, certainly. Yeah.
qualification. So is that just a difference between politics and celebrity culture per se, or are there instances where the voice is actually really prominent to the celebrity image?
I think it's maybe not the voice specifically, but certainly the occupation. I'm thinking of some images, and this is really casting my mind back. So please, please forgive me for any errors here. But of the Benjamin Disraeli, there's a lot of iconography of him. And in the same sort of vein as what we see of Oscar Wilde. So I think it's probably, again, related to that charisma aspect that might not be the voice, but it might be, as someone said before, about Einstein's hair or Beethoven's scowl or things like that. So certainly there are physical things we latch onto, but I mean, my research is really about images. So I'd probably have to sort of think about that. And the research I did, I looked at Melba and Lind, I looked at images of Byron, images of Percy Grainger as well in an Australian context, because Grainger and Melba are great friends, and how those images travelled over time more than anything. So I was looking for the same image in different places and trying to see how they'd been turned into lithographs or reversed or things like that. So yeah, probably can't say much more than that, Paul, about a voice, but I think it's perhaps about intangible elements that people might be able to latch onto as a stereotype. And as I said, with the cartoons and caricatures, we need those things for that to work. So perhaps there's something in that.
Yeah, I mean, just as a follow-up too, like it's pretty clear why in the 19th century the voice can't travel far, just for, you know, technological reasons. But once you get into the 20th century and you have the mechanical recording apparatuses, it should be possible for those images
certainly
to bear the weight. So it'd be interesting if they...
Yeah, sorry. I think with Melba, for instance, she retired in 1924, died in 1932. Her first recordings were around the turn of the century, and they're big chunk. I happen to have a copy of one of them that's from 1901, very big sort of things. And again, that's a privilege thing, is that not everybody could have a gramophone or a phonograph. They could go and see her at the train station. And she was a pretty prolific concert giver. So I think once her fame had established and her celebrity established, and we see those images going before the person did catch up, and the people did catch up, I think, with the actual fame of the person, her singing her songs and whatever. And I mean, lots of people heard her sing at the opening of Parliament House, right? So I think it certainly is related, but my sense is that her image-based celebrity already existed before that happened.
We'll read an online comment. Dickens toured his voice around, voice linked to image via lecture circuit. That's Martin Joly.
Yeah.
And entirely right. Dickens gave these famous recitals.
I think, again, like, it's about scale, I think, is that we see, like, Franz Liszt, for instance, was the first classical pianist to give concerts that were advertised on posters. But there's a certain amount of people that can go to that. Whereas, as Frank was saying, with the explosion of print technology, images and stories and, like, the Jenny Lind Reverie, you know, quotation from 1850 could travel much more easily, I think, than someone attending perhaps a talk. Although I completely acknowledge that, you know, some people it's not like nobody saw the celebrities and they only saw an image, right? Again, I'm not an expert in Dickens and his particular, you know, oeuvre, but I think we get into a time where that was much more democratized, that sort of contact, I suspect. But thank you to Martin for that comment.
Yeah, well, thanks again, Rachel, for a fascinating talk.